President Trump will address the United Nations General Assembly this morning, little less than 3 hours from now. And one of the top topics could be the tensions with Iran. This morning, the president tweeted, quote, "Despite requests, I have no plans to meet Iranian President Hassan Rouhani. Maybe someday in the future. I'm sure he's an absolutely lovely man." Exclamation point.
What?
Yeah. But Rouhani told NBC News yesterday that
Wait, now hold on. Can we go back to that tweet?
No,
I want to go back to the tweet.
Let's just move past them.
I am sure he is an absolutely lovely man. This is...
It could be so much worse, Joe.
Far different than what he was saying while the Obama administration was negotiating with that absolutely lovely man. It's fascinating.
Breathing. But Rouhani told NBC News yesterday that he has no intention of meeting with Trump, saying that the U.S. would first have to re-enter the 2015 nuclear deal. Joining us now, former DOD official and former executive director of the Graham Talent WMD Commission, Dr. Evelyn Farkas. She is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and an MSNBC national security analyst. Also with us, the dean of Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, Vali Nasser. And thank you so much for the beautiful event in honor of my father last week with Madeleine Albright.
That was wonderful.
It was really great. Good to have you both.
Thank you so much for doing that. Vali, let me ask you first. There were fears coming into this administration that Donald Trump would be a warmonger along the lines of his national security advisor, John Bolton, talking about bombing Iran, bombing North Korea. In fact, if anybody has reason to be concerned with Donald Trump right now, it would be people like John Bolton, because he's bending over backwards, paying compliments to Kim Jong-un, and now saying the leader of Iran is a lovely man. How do you sort through that? What do you make of it?
Well, I think the president, as was the case with North Korea, wants to talk to Iran. He wants to have his own deal. The reason he came out of the nuclear deal because it was Obama's deal. So he actually wants to cut a deal with Iran. But I think Bolton and perhaps others in his national security team want to go the full load with Iran. They want potentially regime change. They want Iran to change in a major way. They don't want to sit down and talk to Iran.
Right.
And as a result, right now, there's tension within the administration. We can see that the president is sending one set of signals, and his national security team is sending a different set of signals.
So let's talk about North Korea. There's been so much chaos on the president's Twitter feed, the Russian summit, the statements he's made, and yet we see the leaders of North and South Korea coming together. We see Donald Trump once again engaging. Has that chaos, sort of that chaos theory that Donald Trump seems to follow in diplomacy, led to some creative solutions in North Korea that we may not have seen if we had had a president that had gone by the book? I guess the best way to ask that question is, are we better off with North and South Korea today than we were in January of 2017?
I think it definitely looks better now, but this picture can change very quickly. The problem is that it's others who are taking advantage of the chaos to build their own strategies to serve their own national interests. It's not just South Korea, it's also China as well that is pursuing its own agenda. For instance, the Trump strategy has created a fissure between the United States and South Korea, United States and Japan. The South Koreans will have to rely on China a lot more to manage North Korea. It looks like the president is very good at creating the chaos, but he doesn't have actually ground game of how does he get this to home. And I think that's what actually the Iranians notice. So, okay, we sit down with him. What comes next? He doesn't have a plan about how he's going to deliver. And they also read New York Times' anonymous piece. They read Bob Woodward's book. And they have a sense that Trump may get him into the room, but he may not be able to deliver on what he promises.
Evelyn, on Iran, and clearly there are different agendas from John Bolton and from the president, but the means of getting to that agenda seems to be the same, which is maximum pressure on the regime. Is there a concern that the maximum pressure leads the Iranian regime to do something, it backs them into a corner where they lash out in some way, whether it's through some terrorist activity around the world, and that creates a military dynamic that might spin out of control or lead to consequences we can't perhaps foresee with John Bolton, as he is, we think, pushing for a regime change there.
Right. I mean, I think the Iranians are not likely to do anything crazy right now because they have the Europeans on their side. And the part that, I think was implied here, but we didn't really talk about yet, is that the president is taking on multiple agreements, trade agreements, non-proliferation agreements across the board simultaneously and without the benefit of having our traditional allies with us. So in the case of the Iranian deal, they were part of the deal. It was basically the P5, the nuclear powers in the UN Security Council, plus Iran. We made the deal. But the Europeans said, we're going to actually stick with the deal. Now, it doesn't mean that much because corporations will decide they don't want to be sanctioned by the U.S. government. But politically, it does mean something to the Iranians. So I don't think they're going to do anything radical. They're also under intense pressure. Vali alluded to that internally. Their people are sick and tired of them spending money on wars in the neighboring countries, including Syria. And in Syria, that's one place where actually our president has been a little bit more hawkish than elsewhere. He's standing his ground there. He's sticking with Secretary Mattis, and he's saying we're not going to leave until we've dealt with the terrorist problem.
You think that's a good thing? Right?
I do think it's a good thing because I think that's where we get some leverage. If we can maintain a presence there, it will help us diplomatically to resolve the overall situation. Plus, there are about 2 million people holed up in Idlib whose lives are at stake in Syria, and these are innocent civilians. Not all of them are fighters.
You've got the Russians, you've got the Iranians, you've got the Syrians, a lot of traffic in Syria, and yet our fighting force right there, a small footprint, is certainly doing an awful lot.
Yeah, they are. And Vali, there's a contrast in tweets I just wanted to point out. The president tweeting this morning that he's sure Rouhani is a lovely man. 2 months ago, on July 22nd, the president tweeted, to Iranian President Rouhani, all caps now, never ever threaten the United States again or you will suffer consequences the likes of which few throughout history have ever suffered before. So what's the president up to now? You say he wants a deal. What does that deal look like? How is it different than the one he just ripped up?
Well, first of all, he's also going into this meeting that he's chairing at the United Nations, which potentially the Iranian president could attend if he wants to, because the meeting is on Iran. And therefore, I think he's trying to also manage that meeting ahead of time. The deal won't be that different. Ultimately, there might be some changes on the sunset clause or ballistic missiles, but the Iranians are also going to ask for certain things. Not everything is going to be on the table, so it'll be a variation of what Obama already agreed to.
And if I can add just something, again, this is typical of the president because he just signed yesterday this agreement with South Korea, this new trade agreement. But this new trade agreement, if you talk to the trade experts, it's not that different.
So John Heilemann, let me ask you, how do voters sort through, let's say, the president of North Korea, where Barack Obama told him that North Korea was the one issue that was going to be keeping him up at night? The first 6 months of the administration, we heard from people high up in the administration that we were headed to a ground war in North Korea. One placed it as a 50-50 possibility. Now, here we are a year and a half later, and the North and the South are talking to each other. Do voters look at that, take that as a positive and a success for Donald Trump's foreign policy?
Well, I think, look, what has happened, I think, with Trump on this is that for the people who are generally at the level of kind of following Trump as a foreign policy president through his Twitter feed, which is certainly the way in which most people get their information about Donald Trump. I think that people who are inclined to think that the way he talks about everything on Twitter is problematic, would look back at some of the bellicose rhetoric and now some of the rhetoric that's like anti-bellicose and see a temperamental issue with Donald Trump. For most people, though, to your point, Joe, earlier, I think who are much more focused on issues that affect them on the domestic level, are much more focused on stuff that rings closer to home. They look at Trump as kind of being a big talker who hasn't actually done that much on the world stage that endangers the country. It's an issue that I think a lot of us are focused on, certainly with the question of Trump's relation to Russia. People still remember, obviously, Helsinki. But on questions like North Korea and South Korea, on questions like the Iran deal, do I think that is going to be a salient voting issue in the midterm elections? I do not.
All right, John Heilemann, thank you very much. Dr. Evelyn Farkas and Vali Nasr, thank you both as well for being on the show this morning.
Thanks so much.
Please come back. And coming up, we'll go inside the infamous June 2016 Trump Tower meeting with the man who organized it. Rob Goldstone explains why he reached out to Don Jr. to connect the Trump campaign with the Russians. Morning Joe is coming right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.